Have you ever wondered how something as ordinary as a sheep's fleece could shape the rise of a kingdom? In the Middle Ages, wool was more than just a fabric for clothing. It was the lifeblood of England's wealth, the quiet treasure that paid for wars, built cathedrals, and filled the coffers of kings. Tonight, we'll step back into the rolling hills and bustling markets of medieval England, where every fleece carried hidden power. From shepherds tending their flocks to merchants counting their profits, you'll see how wool became the thread that tied together an entire society. Stay with me as we uncover the surprisingly boring but world-changing story of why wool made England rich in the Middle Ages. The Golden Fleece, how wool became medieval England's treasure. Chapter 1. If you close your eyes and imagine medieval England, perhaps you picture knights in shining armor, kings on their thrones, or peasants laboring in muddy fields. Yet, beneath all the banners and castles, one humble commodity quietly shaped the kingdom's prosperity: wool. More than swords or silver, more than grain or iron, wool was the thread that bound together England's medieval economy. To begin with, it is worth noting just how deeply sheep were woven into the fabric of daily life. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the English countryside was thick with flocks. Travelers crossing the rolling hills of Yorkshire, the Cotswolds, or the Welsh marshes would have seen sheep almost everywhere, thousands upon thousands grazing across pastures, tended by shepherds wrapped in coarse cloaks, accompanied by shaggy dogs. The sheer scale of sheep farming was immense. England, with its cool and damp climate, was perfectly suited to raising sheep that grew long, soft wool fibers. These fibers, when spun and woven, were prized across Europe for their quality and durability. But the value of wool did not lie simply in warm cloaks for villagers. Its true importance came from trade. Medieval England, unlike later centuries when it developed bustling industries of its own, did not initially process all its raw wool into cloth at home. Instead, raw fleeces were exported, shipped across the Channel to Flanders and Italy, where skilled weavers turned them into the fine cloth that clothed Europe's nobility. From Bruges to Florence, English wool became the raw material for the continent's booming textile industry. One way to grasp the significance is to look at taxation records. By the reign of Edward I in the late 13th century, wool was so valuable that it was called the jewel in the realm's crown. Kings relied on taxes levied on wool exports to fund their wars, their courts, and their projects. The crown imposed duties on every sack of wool shipped abroad, creating a steady and lucrative source of income. Even more telling, when Edward III launched the 100 Years' War against France in the 14th century, one of his first measures was to seize wool supplies and control their export. War, diplomacy, and finance, all were tied to this one commodity. At the same time, wool trade influenced the geography of England itself. Certain regions became famous for producing the best wool. The Cotswolds, with their rolling pastures, produced fleeces known for their softness and length. Lincolnshire and Yorkshire generated high-quality wool that fetched premium prices. Monasteries also played a key role. Great abbeys like Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, Tintern Abbey in Wales, and Cistercian houses scattered across the countryside raised vast flocks, their monks managing sheep farming on a near-industrial scale. These monastic estates sold wool in bulk, striking deals with Italian merchants who traveled north to secure contracts. Consider, for instance, the Lombard merchants of Italy. By the 13th century, they had established strong networks in England, buying up wool directly from monasteries and shipping it south to the looms of Florence. There, English wool was transformed into the famous Florentine cloth, dyed in brilliant colors and sold at enormous profits. Thus, a thread shorn from the back of an English sheep might end up woven into a doublet worn by a Florentine banker, or a gown worn by a French noblewoman. What makes this history quietly fascinating is the way an ordinary animal, the sheep, carried the weight of an entire kingdom's fortunes. While peasants spun their rough homespun wool for daily use, the greater wealth of the realm flowed from wool exports. It was the peasants' labor, the shepherd's watchful eyes, and the landowner's estates that together fed this trade. Even the smallest village contributed, for almost every rural settlement had sheep grazing in its fields. Their fleeces sheared each spring and bundled for sale. The wool trade also helped shape English towns. Ports like Boston and Lincolnshire, and later London, grew into hubs of commerce where wool was collected, taxed, and shipped. Boston, in particular, became one of the busiest ports in England during the 13th century, with Italian and Hanseatic merchants crowding its markets to secure wool supplies. Inland towns like Stamford and Winchester became famous for hosting great wool fairs, where sellers and buyers negotiated prices in bustling, noisy gatherings that might last for weeks. These fairs were not just markets. They were engines of connection, tying together distant regions in a web of trade. And yet, while the wealth was undeniable, it was not evenly shared. A peasant who raised sheep might see little more than a meager income, enough to pay rents and survive another year. The true profits flowed upward to landlords, monasteries, merchants, and above all, the crown. This uneven distribution of wealth would, in time, fuel discontent, as common folk wondered why their hard labor fattened the coffers of lords and kings. If you imagine the rhythm of this trade, it begins with the cycle of the seasons. In spring, sheep were sheared, their thick coats removed in careful strokes with iron shears. The fleeces were sorted and cleaned, bundled into sacks, and transported by cart or pack horse to collection points. Merchants purchased them, weighing each sack and recording it in their ledgers. From there, the wool might travel to a port, loaded onto a ship bound for Bruges or Calais. Along the way, tolls were paid, taxes collected, and officials recorded every movement. By the time the wool reached a Flemish weaver's hands, it had already passed through many layers of commerce and control. The wealth from this trade built more than castles and crowns. It left a lasting mark on the English landscape. Churches constructed in prosperous wool towns were funded by this wealth, the so-called wool churches of East Anglia, with their tall towers and elaborate stonework, still stand today as reminders of the trade's importance. Merchants who grew rich from wool endowed chantries, sponsored local projects, and left behind a physical legacy of prosperity. And so, you see, wool was not merely a product. It was a system, an engine of wealth, and a thread that connected humble shepherds to kings, villages to distant cities, and England to the wider medieval world. But this raises a question. If wool was so vital, how did England manage the risks of depending so heavily on one commodity? What happened when supply faltered, or when political conflicts disrupted trade? Chapter 2. If Section 1 revealed how wool rose to dominate England's medieval economy, Section 2 must look more closely at how this trade was governed, controlled, and protected. For in truth, England's wealth from wool was not an accident of sheep and pasture alone. It was carefully directed through laws, taxes, monopolies, and privileges that ensured kings, merchants, and institutions squeezed every ounce of value from the trade. To understand this, you first need to imagine the wool sack. This was not just a container, but a symbol. The sack of wool became the official unit of measurement for trade, weighing roughly 364 pounds, though the exact weight could vary by region. By the 14th century, Parliament itself recognized the importance of wool so deeply that a ceremonial wool sack was created in the House of Lords. The Lord Chancellor sat upon it as a coquille, symbolic reminder that the kingdom's wealth and political power quite literally rested on wool. But before wool reached such heights of symbolism, it was subject to a very practical system of control. From the 1270s onward, English monarchs imposed heavy customs duties on every sack exported. This tax was known as the Great Custom, and it became one of the crown's most dependable sources of revenue. Every merchant, whether English or foreign, had to pay it before sending wool abroad. These customs could be crippling, in some cases as much as a third of the wool's value, but they filled royal treasuries at a time when kings needed constant funds for wars and governance. What is fascinating is how this taxation reshaped the trade itself. Merchants began to seek privileges and exemptions. Some foreign merchants, particularly the Italian Lombards and the Hanseatic League from Germany, negotiated special rights with the crown. These agreements gave them protection for their goods and more predictable taxes in exchange for lending money to the king or providing financial services. Thus, wool became intertwined with banking. Loans and debts secured against future shipments of fleeces. The famous staple system formalized this further. By the mid-14th century, the crown designated certain towns as staple ports, where all wool for export had to be collected, taxed, and sold. The most famous was Calais, captured by the English in 1347 during the 100 Years' War. For nearly 2 centuries afterward, Calais served as the great funnel of England's wool trade. Merchants were required to bring their wool there, ensuring the crown could monitor, tax, and profit from every sack. The merchants of the staple, a powerful guild, oversaw the process, controlling who could buy, who could sell, and at what prices. The staple system shows how tightly wool was bound to politics. Edward III, desperate for money to fund campaigns in France, relied on wool customs as a dependable revenue stream. At times, he mortgaged entire wool harvests to Italian bankers, promising them the proceeds in exchange for immediate loans. When he defaulted, as he often did, it shook international credit networks, a medieval echo of financial crises we might recognize today. Yet while kings and great merchants reaped fortunes, wool also shaped the lives of townsfolk. Consider the wool fairs, sprawling events that drew traders from across Europe. At St. Ives in Cambridgeshire or Stamford in Lincolnshire, vast temporary markets were set up, with stalls, warehouses, and inns buzzing with activity. Merchants haggled, scribes recorded transactions, porters carried heavy sacks, and officials collected tolls. These fairs became centers of not just trade, but also culture. Minstrels performed, pilgrims mingled with merchants, and locals earned side incomes by renting out barns or offering meals. For villagers, the wool fair was both an economic lifeline and a break in the monotony of rural life. But wealth also bred tension. The high value of wool attracted smugglers, thieves, and corrupt officials. Smuggling was a particular concern in coastal regions. Unscrupulous merchants would attempt to ship wool out of England secretly, avoiding taxes. The crown cracked down harshly, posting guards at ports, issuing licenses, and even executing offenders. At the same time, disputes flared between merchants and local lords, as each sought to control tolls, rights of passage, and access to markets. One overlooked detail is how much ordinary labor was hidden in these grand systems of trade. Peasants and smallholders, who did the hard work of tending sheep and shearing wool, often saw little benefit. They were obligated to sell fleeces at fixed prices, sometimes dictated by landlords or guilds. Monasteries, with their vast estates, could undercut small farmers by selling in bulk directly to merchants. And so, while the wool trade enriched the realm, it deepened inequalities. With wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, the control of wool also had profound cultural effects. It shaped the architecture of towns, as seen in the great wool churches of East Anglia and the Cotswolds, whose tall towers and ornate stone carvings were funded by merchant wealth. It shaped the daily rhythms of life. Shepherds worked by the seasons, shearing in spring, lambing in early summer, driving flocks to market in autumn. Even law and governance bent around wool, with royal courts hearing endless disputes about contracts, weights, and fraudulent sales. By the 5th-10th century, England's reliance on wool was both a strength and a weakness. It gave the crown steady income, merchants power, and towns prosperity, but it also left the realm vulnerable. When wars disrupted trade routes or when foreign markets shrank, the effects rippled across the countryside. For instance, during the Black Death of the mid-14th century, labor shortages and collapsing demand struck the wool industry hard, leading to a crisis that forced adaptation. What is especially telling is that the wool trade became not only an economic pillar, but also a matter of national identity. Chroniclers of the age wrote of wool as the foundation of England's greatness. Parliament enshrined it in ritual. Kings boasted of it in their financial negotiations. And foreign merchants, whether Florentine bankers or Flemish weavers, recognized English wool as unrivaled in quality. Yet, by concentrating so heavily on raw wool exports, England also ceded part of its economic destiny to others. The Flemish and Italian textile industries grew rich on English wool, producing fine cloth that England itself could not yet rival. Only later, in the 15th and 16th centuries, did England turn to building its own cloth-making industry, keeping more of the value at home. But in the centuries we are considering, wool was still primarily exported raw, a reminder of both England's bounty and its limitations. If Section 1 introduced wool as the lifeblood of medieval England, Section 2 has shown you how that lifeblood was managed, taxed, and controlled, a system that fed kings, shaped towns, and bound peasants and merchants alike into a web of commerce. But the story is not yet complete. For even as wool enriched England, it carried within it seeds of change. The question to carry forward is this: how did the dominance of wool eventually reshape England's society itself, altering its classes, its economy, and even its long-term destiny? Chapter 3. By now, you've seen how England's medieval wealth quite literally grew on the backs of sheep, and how this trade was carefully managed through taxes, fairs, and the staple system. But the question remains, what did all this wealth do to English society? How did fleeces, spun from quiet hillsides, alter the way people lived, thought, and governed themselves? To begin, consider the rise of a new class, the merchant elite. For much of the early Middle Ages, landowning nobles and powerful monasteries dominated wealth and influence. But the wool trade introduced a new kind of power, rooted not in hereditary titles or church patronage, but in commerce. Families of merchants, dealing in wool on a grand scale, built fortunes that rivaled those of barons. They constructed manor-like townhouses, endowed churches with stained glass, and married into the lower nobility, blurring the lines between merchant and lord. In East Anglia, for example, merchants like the Paston family accumulated wealth through wool, then used it to buy land and influence. The Paston Letters, a famous collection of correspondence from the 15th century, show how such families maneuvered between trade and aristocracy. In the Cotswolds, in towns like Chippingcampden, merchants built wool churches, vast parish structures with elaborate towers, whose beauty still astonishes visitors today. These were statements of wealth, but also of permanence. Wool had allowed townspeople to leave a legacy in stone, yet the benefits of wool wealth were uneven. While merchants prospered, ordinary peasants found themselves caught in shifting economic tides. After the Black Death in the mid-14th century, labor shortages briefly gave peasants more bargaining power. Shepherds could demand higher wages, and some tenants even bought their freedom. But lords soon fought back, passing laws like the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which tried to cap wages and tie workers more tightly to the land. The wool trade made sheep more valuable, which in turn made landlords eager to expand pastures, often at the expense of peasants, who were evicted from their plots to make room for flocks. This process, sometimes described as an early form of enclosure, reshaped the landscape. Villages that once bustled with farmers shrank or vanished altogether, while wide sheep pastures spread across the countryside. Thomas More, writing in the 16th century, would later lament that sheep eat men, capturing how pastures consumed the livelihoods of displaced peasants. While that phrase belongs to a slightly later period, its roots lay in the medieval obsession with wool profits. The political influence of wool wealth was also unmistakable. Kings, as we've seen, leaned heavily on wool customs for revenue. But this reliance gave merchants leverage. The crown had to negotiate with the merchants of the staple and the broader community of traders to ensure continued cooperation. Over time, these negotiations contributed to the growing role of Parliament in English governance. For every new tax on wool, kings were expected to seek parliamentary approval, drawing representatives of towns, many dominated by wool merchants, deeper into national politics. In this sense, fleeces quietly helped expand the role of representative government. Beyond politics, wool reshaped England's international relationships. Flanders, with its great cities like Ghent and Bruges, depended on English wool for its textile industry. A steady stream of English sacks fed Flemish looms, producing the fine cloths sold across Europe. But this dependency also made the Low Countries a political battleground. English kings sought alliances with Flemish cities, while France tried to cut them off. Wars in the 14th century often hinged on who could control wool supplies, not only for money, but for leverage over allies. This entanglement with Flanders explains why Edward III and his successors worked so hard to secure Calais as a staple port. Controlling Calais meant controlling the very doorway through which English wool reached Europe. The city became a linchpin of strategy, economy, and diplomacy alike, held by England until 1558 as both fortress and marketplace. Culturally, wool wealth left visible marks everywhere. Churches rose higher, windows blazed with color, and altars glittered with donations from wool merchants seeking salvation for their souls. Town guilds, enriched by trade, sponsored plays and processions. Even the rhythms of daily life adapted. Shearing festivals marked the summer, fairs structured the year, and ships filled with sacks defined the pace of ports. To live in medieval England was, in some sense, to live in the shadow of wool. But wool wealth also carried vulnerabilities. By exporting raw wool rather than finished cloth, England remained dependent on foreign weavers and markets. When wars or embargoes disrupted trade, the effects were severe. This fragility prompted a slow shift in strategy. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, England began investing more in its own cloth-making industry. Weavers, fullers, and dyers became more common, and laws were passed to encourage domestic production. Over time, England transformed from being primarily a supplier of raw materials to becoming a center of finished textiles, a change that would fuel its later economic strength. Still, in the centuries we have been considering, wool remained the jewel of the realm. Its profits built castles, funded wars, and transformed towns. It gave rise to merchant dynasties and altered the very map of the countryside. Even Parliament's traditions were shaped by wool. The Lord Chancellor still sits upon a ceremonial wool sack, stuffed today with wool not just from Britain, but from across the Commonwealth. A reminder of how central this trade once was. And so, when you picture medieval England, it is worth looking past the kings and knights and castles, and instead imagining the flocks of sheep grazing on quiet hillsides. Their fleeces shorn and bundled into heavy sacks, carried on carts to ports and fairs, were the threads that stitched together an entire economy. In the end, wool was more than a commodity. It was a force that altered landscapes, shifted power, and set England on a path toward its later prosperity. Yet it is also a story of paradox, of wealth built on humble flocks, of prosperity that displaced peasants, of riches that depended on the labor of many but enriched the few. And perhaps that is the most striking legacy of wool. Not only that it made England rich, but that it revealed how deeply even the most ordinary of things, like the fleece of a sheep, can shape the destiny of a nation. The open question remains, if wool could transform England so profoundly in the Middle Ages, What other humble commodities, unnoticed in daily life, might have carried equal power in shaping the histories of other lands? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight, exploring the slow but fascinating story of how wool helped shape medieval England. I hope the gentle details carried you toward rest, or maybe just gave you a new way to think about the past. If you enjoyed this calm journey through history, I'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Your support helps me continue creating these peaceful stories for you. Until next time, may your night be restful, and may history always keep you company as you drift into sleep.